Welcome to the Playing Books podcast. So imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where the words straight and gay just, well, they simply don't exist.
Like, at all.
Right, at all. Not because people are being censored or because there's some authoritarian regime silencing everyone, but because those concepts literally haven't been invented yet.
It's a completely wild thought experiment.
It really is. You look around and you realize that your entire understanding of desire, of identity, of who you fundamentally are, is basically a linguistic and cultural ghost.
Yeah, a total invention.
Exactly. Well, today we are going to dismantle the very architecture of human desire. We are exploring a book that completely reshapes how we understand the erotic.
And, the hidden psychological forces that have secretly authored what we think of when we think of sex.
Right. It is a genuinely paradigm-shifting text. We are discussing the book, The Psychology of Sex, The Psychology of Everything, by Dr. Meg-John Barker.
Yeah, and to give you some context on the author, Dr. Barker is a writer, an illustrator, a sex and relationship therapist, and a queer activist.
Which is quite the resume.
I mean, it really is. And what makes her perspective so compelling is that it bridges this dense academic psychology with the incredibly practical, messy, lived reality of the therapy room.
Which is so needed. And we are specifically looking at the second edition of this book, published in 2026, right?
Yes, the 2026 edition. Dr. Barker has significantly updated this one to include some crucial new insights regarding trauma, the unconscious, and just how our bodies hold on to cultural pain.
But before we take another step, I want to ask you, yes, you listening right now, to do something for me. I want you to take a second and mentally define what the word sex means to you right now.
Just whatever comes up first.
Yeah, whatever imagery, whatever physical acts, whatever feelings pop into your head, just hold on to that. Because I promise you, by the time we reach the end of this episode, that definition you're holding in your mind is going to be completely dismantled and transformed.
I love that exercise.
Huh.
And as we begin this podcast, I do want to offer a gentle suggestion.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Dr. Barker explicitly advises readers to practice self-consent when engaging with this material, and I really want to echo that here for you. Please, go slowly.
Take your time with it.
Exactly. The topic of sex isn't just an abstract intellectual playground, It is deeply intertwined with our most profound personal vulnerabilities and cultural experiences.
Right. It's heavy stuff.
It is. Most of us carry some form of societal shame, and many carry histories involving non-consensual experiences or trauma. So if at any point during this episode you feel overwhelmed, or your heart rate spikes, or you just feel confused,
It is completely okay to pause.
yes, step away. Tune into your own body. Taking care of your own well-being is the absolute priority.
Absolutely. Listen to your body today. Now, jumping right into the content, the very first chapter of the book introduces a premise that honestly stopped me in my tracks.
Oh, the funhouse mirror concept.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because we usually think of Western psychology as this perfectly objective science, right? We picture a neutral observer in a lab coat, sitting back with a clipboard, taking notes on human behavior.
Like, they're just discovering hard, immutable facts about sex.
Right, exactly. But Dr. Barker argues something radically different. They argue that psychology isn't just observing sex, it is actively creating and sustaining our cultural understandings of it.
Precisely. The book argues that it is not a one-way street of scientific discovery. It's a massive, ongoing cultural feedback loop.
A feedback loop, right?
Yeah, because we have to remember how the mechanism of research actually works. Psychologists do not exist in a vacuum. They're human beings embedded in their specific cultural moment.
Carrying all the biases of their era.
Exactly. When they design a study, the very questions they think to ask, the behaviors they decide are actually worth measuring, and the terminology they use, it's all steeped in cultural assumption.
Okay, wait, here's where it gets really interesting. Let me push back on that a little bit. Because I think a lot of people hearing this might say, but isn't science objective?
Right. They have data.
Yeah, they use data, they use control groups, they measure heart rates and brain waves. How can the data itself be biased?
It's a great question. And it really comes down to what we choose to measure and how we frame the results. Let's look at the actual mechanism.
Okay, let's play it out.
Let's say a 1950s psychologist decides to study marital satisfaction. Because of their cultural lens, they only survey heterosexual, legally married couples who live in the suburbs.
Right, because to them, that's what marriage is.
Exactly. They collect hard data, sure. But the boundaries of that data were drawn by cultural prejudice. Then they publish a paper defining normal sexual frequency.
And then the media gets a hold of it.
Yes. That research feeds into popular culture. It gets written up in a magazine or discussed on a talk show. Suddenly, a teenager or a young couple reads that magazine, looks at their own life and says, oh no, we don't match the scientific definition of normal.
Wow. So they actually change their behavior to align with the supposed science.
They do. They contort themselves to fit the data.
I see. It's like a funhouse mirror. So psychology isn't a clear glass window looking into human nature. It's a mirror reflecting our own societal hang-ups back at us.
But dressing them up as science.
Right, making them look like hard science. And then we contort ourselves to match the warped reflection, which just gives the next generation of psychologists a totally manufactured reality to study all over again.
That is exactly the dynamic Dr. Barker is pointing out.
Mm.
And to illustrate how distorting that mirror can be, we really only have to look at history.
Because it shifts so much, right?
Oh, entirely. What appears to be completely objective, indisputable science to one generation often looks highly disturbing to the next.
Like what, for example?
Well, Dr. Barker points out that the way we study and categorize sex today might look as strange and troubling to people in 100 years as early historical intelligence testing looks to us now.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the early IQ tests.
Right. We now know that early IQ tests were often deeply flawed, culturally biased, and used to justify terrible prejudices. And it was all done under the guise of objective science.
And the science of sex is equally susceptible to that kind of era-specific blindness.
Completely.
And part of the reason it's so messy is that the word sex isn't even one single thing in the field of psychology. The book lays out that researchers are actually juggling at least 5 completely different meanings of the word.
Often without clarifying which one they mean, yeah.
Which is wild. So what are those 5 meanings?
Well, according to the book, first, psychology studies sex as an identity or orientation. So, meaning who you are attracted to.
Okay, so that's one, the identity part.
Second, it studies sex as a physical act, just the pure mechanics of what bodies do with each other. Third, it attempts to categorize sex in terms of normal versus abnormal practices.
Like creating behavioral rules.
Exactly. Fourth, it looks at sex as a cultural phenomenon, studying sexiness, media representation, and societal trends.
Right, the pop culture side of it.
Yeah. And finally, the fifth meaning, which is heavily emphasized in this updated edition, is sex as an unconscious process. The deep, often hidden eroticism that is deeply intertwined with our trauma and our psyches.
It's wild to think that when you see a headline saying new psychological study on sex, they could be talking about an identity, a biological friction, a cultural movie trope, or a deep childhood trauma.
All using the exact same 3-letter word.
Right. But if psychology is just a funhouse mirror, what exactly were people doing before the mirror was built?
Well, to understand that, we have to travel back to the moment when our current categories of sexuality were literally invented.
And this is where Dr. Barker drops a historical bombshell that really shakes the foundation of how most of us view ourselves.
It's a huge shift.
According to the historical consensus presented in the book, prior to the 19th century, the concepts of homosexuality and heterosexuality simply did not exist as identities.
Just weren't there.
Okay, let's pause right there to let that sink in, because that is a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Are you saying people weren't having same-sex relations before the 1800s?
No, not at all. Human beings have been engaging in every conceivable variety of sexual acts since the dawn of our species. The behavior has always been there.
Okay, so what changed?
The monumental shift is in the meaning attached to the behavior. Before the 19th century, sex was understood primarily as something you did. It was an action.
It was not something you were.
Right. If you lived in the 1700s, it wouldn't have made any consensual sense to declare yourself straight or gay. You might have engaged in certain behaviors that your local society or religion deemed a sin.
Or a crime, or just a quirky habit.
Yeah. But it wasn't a demographic identity that defined your fundamental soul.
So how did we get from, hey, sex is just a thing you do, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, to this is the core demographic truth of my existence?
The book traces this back to the late 19th century. You have the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, people are moving to cities in huge numbers.
Everything is shifting.
Exactly. And simultaneously, you have the rise of early sexologists. We were talking about figures like Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Magnus Hirschfeld, and Henry Havelock Ellis.
The Victorian medical men.
Yes. These were medical men operating in a very Victorian framework, and they possessed this intense scientific urge to classify absolutely everything in the natural world.
So they turned that lens on human desire.
They did. They started applying that biological taxonomy to sex. Krafft-Ebing, for instance, wrote a famous book called Psychopathia Sexualis, which was essentially a massive catalog of what he considered sexual deviance.
They were basically making folders and filing people into them based on their desires.
Exactly. And then Sigmund Freud entered the picture and cemented this shift with psychoanalysis.
Ah, Freud. He always shows up.
Always. Freud argued that sexuality wasn't just a series of random acts. He believed it developed through specific childhood stages and ultimately hardened into a fixed, essential part of an adult's psychological makeup.
So Freud comes along and tells Western society, look, this isn't just an action you take on a Tuesday night. This is the very core of your psychological identity.
Formed in your youth,
Yeah.
dictating who you are, yes. And Dr. Barker points out the profound, double-edged consequences of this invention of sexual orientation.
Double-edged how?
Well, on one hand, it was disastrous. Because sexuality was now seen as a fixed, medicalized identity, it allowed people to be systematically pathologized.
Because they weren't just sinning anymore.
Right. You weren't just someone who committed a sinful act. You were a diseased type of person.
Yeah.
And this led to horrific psychiatric treatments and widespread criminalization.
That's the dark side. What was the other edge of the sword?
The unintended consequence. Because these individuals were now categorized as a distinct group, it gave them the language to find one another.
Oh, I see.
It allowed them to form subcultures, to build communities, and eventually to organize and fight for their civil rights. As the book notes, you cannot have a gay rights movement without the foundational concept of a gay identity.
It's an incredible paradox. The exact same medical classification that birthed immense oppression also provided the framework needed for liberation.
It's really fascinating history.
But even as these identities were solidifying in the early 20th century, the cultural taboos around actually talking about the behavior were still suffocating.
Oh, the silence was deafening.
Nobody knew what anyone else was actually doing behind closed doors. Which brings us to the 1940s and a biologist named Alfred Kinsey.
Kinsey is such a fascinating figure in this timeline. He wasn't originally a psychologist, he was an entomologist.
He studied bugs.
Yes, he spent years studying the tiny biological variations in gull wasps. He looked at thousands of bugs and cataloged how diverse they were without any moral judgment.
Right, because you don't judge a wasp for being different.
Exactly. When he turned his attention to human beings, he brought that exact same lens. He looked around and saw the immense damage being caused by cultural silence.
People were suffering deeply.
They were feeling like monsters because they harbored desires that didn't fit the rigid normal categories invented in the 19th century. So Kinsey set out to simply measure the raw behavior.
And the mechanism of how he did this is amazing. He and his team conducted thousands of deeply intensive face-to-face interviews.
Thousands of them, yeah.
And they developed a way of asking questions that assumed the behavior had already happened to just completely remove the shame.
That was the genius of his method.
Instead of asking, have you ever done this terrible thing, they would ask, when did you first do this? And the statistics they published in the Kinsey reports, which are highlighted in Dr. Barker's book, absolutely shook the world.
They were explosive. Remember, this is post-war America. The idealized image is the perfectly chaste heterosexual nuclear family.
Right, the white picket fence.
But Kinsey's team found that 92% of men and 62% of women had masturbated.
Which was completely taboo to admit.
Totally. They found that 70% of couples had engaged in oral sex. They found that vast majorities of people were having premarital sex, and a significant portion were having same-sex experiences.
He essentially held up a mirror to society and proved that the normal, chaste ideal that the culture was brutally policing basically didn't exist in reality.
Everyone was failing the test.
Everyone. But wait, Kinsey didn't just give us statistics. He changed the shape of how we measure attraction, right?
He did. He introduced what we now call the Kinsey scale. Instead of the strict binary system where you were locked into either the 100% heterosexual box or the 100% homosexual box, Kinsey proposed a spectrum.
Ranging from 0 to 6.
Yes. He recognized that human attraction is incredibly fluid. A person might be mostly attracted to the opposite sex, but have occasional same-sex fantasies, or vice versa.
Which was a huge relief for people, I'm sure.
The scale was a monumental leap forward in acknowledging reality. But, as Dr. Barker argues in the book, even a spectrum is not quite enough.
Because at the end of the day, a spectrum is still just a straight line between 2 points. It only measures the gender of the person you're attracted to.
It's still limiting.
Right, it doesn't capture how you're attracted to them or under what circumstances.
Precisely. Which is why Dr. Barker advocates for what is known as the biopsychosocial model. This is a critical concept in the book.
Break that down for us.
The biopsychosocial model proposes that your sexuality isn't a point on a line. It is an entirely unique, fluid, and complex configuration. It is an ongoing interaction of three massive systems.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, biology. This is your genetics, your hormones, your physical anatomy, your nervous system.
Just the physical hardware of your body.
Yeah. Second, psychology. This includes your specific thoughts, your emotions, the meaning you assign to things, and crucially, your past traumas.
The software, basically.
Right. And third, the social realm. This is the specific culture you live in, the religion you were raised with, the media you consume, the power dynamics of your society.
So to really understand how this works mechanically, let's play this out. If someone experiences a specific desire in a specific moment, it's not just because they're wired that way.
No, it's never that simple.
It might be a biological surge of hormones combined with a psychological need for comfort stemming from a stressful day, interacting with a social script they learned from a romantic movie they watched as a teenager.
Yes, exactly.
All three of those gears are turning simultaneously to create that one single moment of desire.
That is a perfect illustration of the mechanism. And what's really liberating about the biopsychosocial model is that it acknowledges that this configuration can shift and change over the course of your life.
It's not set in stone.
Not at all. If your psychology changes through therapy, or your biology changes through aging, or your social environment changes because you move to a new country, your sexual configuration will likely shift as well.
It is a living, breathing ecosystem, not a rigid category.
That's a great way to put it.
That is so deeply freeing. It means you don't owe allegiance to a specific label. I want you, the listener, to think about those demographic boxes you are forced to tick on medical forms or surveys. Heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual.
We fill them out all the time.
Right. Do those little check boxes actually capture your specific behaviors, your shifting fantasies, your entire biopsychosocial reality?
They really don't.
Or are they just crude approximations capturing the community you feel safe aligning with in this current cultural climate? It really exposes how inadequate our language is.
It truly does. And once Dr. Barker guides us to recognize how much of who we are having sex with has been artificially constructed by history, the book forces us to pivot to the next logical question.
Which is?
How much of what we are actually doing in bed has been artificially dictated by these same forces?
And this is where we have to look at the myth of proper sex. Why does society insist there's a correct mechanical way to be intimate?
It's so pervasive.
Dr. Barker shares this striking anecdote in the book that blew my mind. For a research project, the author actually sat down and read 65 different sex advice manuals.
65 of them.
Yes. Along with countless problem pages in magazines and documentaries. Just imagine the sheer volume of reading 65 sex manuals.
I can't even imagine.
But the findings were shockingly uniform. Almost all of them define the word sex exclusively as penis in vagina intercourse, often abbreviated in the book as PIV, with the ultimate mandatory goal of orgasm.
And that definition is so culturally pervasive that it functions like water to a fish. We don't even notice it's there.
We just accept it as reality.
But Dr. Barker points out the immense psychological damage this causes. When you define real sex that narrowly, you actively marginalize a vast universe of human erotic experience.
Right. Everything else gets pushed aside.
Exactly. If PIV intercourse ending in mutual orgasm is the only event that counts as the main attraction, then everything else is demoted. Solo sex, manual stimulation, and oral sex are reduced to mere foreplay.
Even the word foreplay.
Yes, the very word foreplay implies it is just an opening act, a precursor lacking its own inherent value. It only exists to prepare the bodies for the real event.
Wow. Yeah.
And practices like kink or anal sex are relegated even further to the margins, framed purely as novelty ways to spice things up when the main course gets boring.
It totally dictates the menu of human pleasure. It creates this hierarchy where one specific act is the gold standard and everything else is just a consolation prize.
And the crazy part is, it wasn't just magazine columnists pushing this.
No.
No, the medical and psychological establishments actually drafted the scientific blueprint for it. The book dives into the history of the sexual response cycle.
Yes, the sexual response cycle.
Right. It's central to understanding how pleasure became medicalized. In the 1960s, researchers William Masters and Virginia Johnson conducted highly publicized laboratory studies.
They literally brought people into labs.
They did. They hooked them up to wires and monitors and observed them having sex. Based on this, they created a universal model of human sexual response. Later, sex therapist Helen Singer Kaplan modified it slightly to add the concept of desire.
Right. So we end up with this rigid four-step mechanical cycle. Step 1, you experience desire. Step 2, you become physically aroused. Step 3, you reach orgasm. Step 4, you experience resolution or the come down.
Exactly. And this four-step cycle became the absolute gospel for psychiatry, medicine, and sex therapy.
It treats the complex human organism like an automobile engine moving through a mandatory sequence of gears.
You turn the key for desire, the engine revs for arousal, it hits top speed at orgasm, and then you turn it off for resolution.
Okay, here's an analogy that came to my mind while reading this part of the book. It feels like the medical establishment built a giant one-size-fits-all car wash.
Oh, a car wash. I like that.
They expect every single human being to put their car in neutral, roll onto the conveyor belt, and pass through the soap stage, the scrub stage, and the blow-dry stage in the exact same order, at the exact same speed.
And if you don't,
Right. So if sex is defined this narrowly, doesn't that mean anyone who doesn't follow this exact mechanical blueprint gets labeled as broken? What if someone enjoys the soap but doesn't want the blow-dry?
that is a brilliant analogy. Exactly. What's fascinating here is how this leads to the concept of sexual dysfunction.
D word.
Yes. Psychiatry basically took that four-step cycle and said, any deviation from this path is a disease. If a person does not experience spontaneous desire to get on the conveyor belt, psychiatry calls it a disorder.
Wow.
If a penis does not get erect, or if a vagina does not produce lubrication to allow for penetration, psychiatry steps in and labels it an arousal disorder.
It's also clinical.
If the final blow-dry stage of orgasm isn't achieved, it is an orgasmic disorder. The individual is essentially told by their doctor that their biological machinery is malfunctioning and requires pharmacological or psychological fixing.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for the listener here. If someone is with their partner and they want to have intercourse, but they physically lose their erection, isn't that a medical issue?
That's the common assumption.
Don't they want that fixed? It feels dismissive to just say, oh, you're not a machine.
It is a totally valid point, and the distress people feel in those moments is very real. But Dr. Barker offers a profoundly compassionate reframing in the book.
Okay, how does the book reframe it?
Instead of instantly jumping to the conclusion that the body is broken, the book suggests that what the medical establishment calls a dysfunction might actually be the body being incredibly sensible and communicative.
Sensible. How is losing an erection or experiencing pain sensible?
Because the body is not just a hydraulic pump. It is inextricably linked to the psyche and the environment. Remember the biopsychosocial model we discussed?
Right, the hardware and software working together.
Yes. If a body refuses to perform on command, it might be fiercely protecting the person. It might be shielding them from revisiting a past trauma that the current situation unconsciously triggered.
Oh, I see.
It might be rebelling against a partner who is emotionally absent or critical. Or it might simply be exhausted and refusing to be treated like an industrial machine that owes a certain output regardless of the emotional context.
That makes a lot of sense.
Our bodies carry profound wisdom. Sometimes what we label as a malfunction is actually a healthy refusal to participate in a script that doesn't feel safe or authentic in that specific moment.
That reframing changes everything. It takes the situation out of the realm of broken mechanics and puts it into the realm of meaning and communication.
It humanizes the experience.
And the book explores how this mechanical expectation destroys relationships, because sex is profoundly relational. If we go back to that example, a loss of an erection isn't just a physical event happening to one isolated body.
It's never in a vacuum.
It is an event occurring in a shared space, and it means something entirely different to each person in the room.
Exactly. Dr. Barker details how the narrow medical model leaves couples completely unequipped to handle natural variations.
How so?
Well, to the person losing the erection, the event might represent a terrifying failure of masculinity, triggering acute performance anxiety.
Right, they feel like less of a man.
But to their partner, sitting right next to them, it might be interpreted as a devastating sign that they are no longer desirable or that the relationship is falling apart. Mainstream advice often perpetuates the myth of perfect synchronicity.
Like they should always be on the exact same wavelength.
The idea that partners in a healthy relationship should naturally want the same amount of sex, the exact same kind of sex, at the exact same time.
Which is statistically impossible over a long timeline.
It is. When discrepancies naturally arise, as they inevitably will, when two complex biopsychosocial organisms try to coordinate their lives over years, the rigid medical model leaves couples feeling like their relationship is doomed.
They think, we are broken.
Exactly. The alternative is recognizing that fluctuating, non-matching desires are a completely normal, expected part of long-term human connection.
Okay, so if the medical car wash model of proper sex is restrictive,
Hmm.
and if expecting to be a perfect, synchronized, orgasm-producing machine is a myth,
Which it is.
it leaves us with a huge question. How do we evaluate what is healthy? How do we figure out what is actually good for us without relying on these heavy, judgmental medical concepts of normal and abnormal?
To answer that, Dr. Barker argues we have to move completely beyond the traditional hierarchy of
A
sex.
higher
Yes. To do this, the book draws heavily on the work of the anthropologist Gail Rubin, who introduced a brilliant and challenging concept called benign variation.
This was one of my favorite parts of the book. Dr. Barker quotes Gail Rubin directly, and the quote is so cutting.
It really gets right to the point.
Rubin writes, "Most people find it difficult to grasp that whatever they like to do sexually will be thoroughly repulsive to someone else, and that whatever repels them sexually will be the most treasured delight of someone, somewhere. Most people mistake their sexual preferences for a universal system."
It is a piercing observation about human ego and our psychological blind spots.
We all think we're the baseline for normal.
We all have a tendency to believe that whatever feels good, natural, and intuitive to us must be the objective standard of health for the entire species.
Right. If I like it, it's natural. If I find it gross, it must be a psychological disorder.
Exactly. And Dr. Barker explains how this exact blind spot has allowed society to construct what Rubin called the sex hierarchy.
Can you walk us through the mechanics of this hierarchy? What does it actually look like?
Imagine a target with concentric rings. At the absolute center, the bullseye, sits the cultural ideal: vanilla, monogamous, heterosexual, reproductive sex occurring within a legally recognized marriage.
The gold standard, quote unquote.
Society views this center ring as the pinnacle of health, morality, and respectability. It is the charmed circle.
Charmed circle. I like that term.
People who operate within this circle are rewarded with social status, legal protections, and positive media representation. But as you move outward from the center, down the hierarchy, things get pushed to the margins.
Like what kind of things?
Unmarried sex, queer sex, non-monogamy, kink, sex work. The further you get from that center rung, the more society views the behavior with suspicion. It gets pathologized by medicine, condemned by religion, and criminalized by the state.
And the book argues that if we want to be psychologically healthy, we desperately need to dismantle this hierarchy. We have to start looking at practices that sit on the outer rings, like BDSM, consensual non-monogamy, and various kinks, not as paraphilias or sicknesses that need to be cured by a therapist.
But as benign variations.
Exactly. We need to view them through the lens of benign variation. They are simply diverse relationship styles.
And Dr. Barker makes a compelling sociological point here. When you actually study these marginalized communities, you often find dynamics that the center ring could learn from.
Oh, really? Give us an example.
For example, individuals practicing consensual non-monogamy or engaging in a BDSM scene generally cannot rely on default societal scripts.
Because there's no blueprint for them on TV.
Right. They can't just assume their partner knows what they want. Therefore, they often have to communicate their boundaries, articulate their desires, and negotiate explicit consent with a level of rigor, honesty, and emotional intelligence that many people in traditional normal marriages never achieve.
They literally have to sit down and write a contract of what is and isn't okay before anything happens. That is the definition of high-level communication.
It really is.
But when we encounter a sexual practice or debate that makes us uncomfortable, how do we process it without just instantly labeling it bad? Because let's be real with the listener for a second. We all have a squirm factor.
Oh, definitely. Everyone has a squirm factor.
When we hear about something way outside our personal charmed circle, our immediate reaction is often discomfort. That knee-jerk judgment is so incredibly fast.
It is incredibly fast, and it takes conscious, deliberate effort to override it. This is where the book becomes very practical.
What's the strategy?
Dr. Barker outlines 3 crucial analytical questions we can use to slow down our brains and navigate any uncomfortable sexual topic or cultural panic. First, we must ask, what exactly are we talking about?
Okay, what exactly are we talking about?
This forces us to define our terms clearly and separate out the actual, observable facts from the emotional rhetoric and moral panic.
Okay, so step 1 is just finding the facts. What's step 2?
Second, we ask, what possibilities does this practice or concept open up, and what does it close down?
Looking at the function, not the morality.
This is vital. Instead of asking the moralistic question, is this good or evil, we evaluate its functional impact. How does it actually affect the people involved?
Okay, and the third question.
And third, how might we creatively engage with this? This means moving away from the binary options of either totally embracing something without question or trying to violently eradicate it.
The book uses the concept of sex addiction to show how this creative engagement works mechanically, right? I think this is a perfect test case to walk through.
It's an excellent example. Let's apply the 3 questions. When someone is compulsively engaging in sexual behaviors to the point that it causes them severe distress or ruins their life, the traditional knee-jerk response from society is to label them as a sex addict.
Right. We give them a medical label.
Yes. And that label almost always forces an eradication approach. The treatment model becomes about total abstinence, viewing the behavior purely as a destructive disease that must be stamped out.
So it's about control and willpower.
But Dr. Barker argues that if we use creative engagement, we ask different questions. We look at the individual and ask, what possibilities does this compulsive behavior open up for them?
And what might the answer to that be? Because on the surface, it just looks destructive.
If you look deeper, you might find that the compulsive behavior is the only mechanism this person has ever found to soothe profound, overwhelming anxiety.
Oh, so it's a coping mechanism.
Or perhaps it is the only arena in their life where they feel a sense of agency and control after a history of abuse.
Wow.
If we just label it bad and try to eradicate it through sheer willpower, we miss the entire underlying function of the behavior. Creative engagement means working alongside the individual to understand why the behavior is happening.
Removing the shame.
It means reducing the immense shame they feel and helping them find healthier, more sustainable ways to meet those underlying emotional needs rather than just slapping a rigid, punitive label on them.
That is such a more humane, functional way to handle human struggles. It treats the person as a complex puzzle to be understood rather than a broken machine to be discarded.
It's so much more effective, too.
But it requires us to stay calm, rational, and curious. And the reality is, debates around sex in our society rarely stay calm.
Very rarely.
Which brings us to the newest and perhaps most vital section of the 2026 edition of this book. Why is it that we so rarely ask these 3 rational questions? Why does the mere topic of sex trigger such massive, unbearable, often violent emotions in our culture?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand that, Dr. Barker guides us to look at the deep intersection of sex and trauma.
Trauma is the key word here.
This new final chapter delves into the profound unconscious drivers of our sexualities. When debates about sex in society become intensely polarized, when you see people screaming at school board meetings, issuing moral panics, trying to ban books or behaviors, it is almost never actually about the specific act being debated.
It's a proxy war.
It is because the topic is tapping into deep, existential themes of safety, belonging, and survival.
Yeah.
And critically, it is tapping into vast reservoirs of unhealed trauma.
The book makes a point that I think will resonate with a lot of people. We live in fundamentally traumatizing cultures.
We do.
And the vital nuance here is that it isn't just the people on the margins, the queer folks, the kink practitioners who are traumatized by society. Even the people who perfectly fit that normal, top-tier, center-ring sexual mold have been impacted by this cultural trauma.
Everyone pays a price.
The intense pressure to conform, the suppression of natural variation, the rigid policing of gender roles, it leaves psychological scars on everyone.
Absolutely. Dr. Barker explains the mechanism of repression here. When a culture dictates that only a tiny, narrow slice of human experience is acceptable, all other natural desires, fantasies, and curiosities do not just magically disappear.
They don't just vanish into thin air.
They are pushed down into the unconscious. They become disowned. And repressed psychological material always finds a way to leak out.
How does it leak out? What does that look like?
Often it leaks inward as intense, paralyzing inner shame, or it lashes outward as projection.
Projection is a big one.
Psychological projection is when we attack in other people the very things we are terrified to acknowledge within ourselves. The cultural rage we see around sex is often disguised fear.
Fear of our own complexities.
Dr. Barker argues that we desperately need to become conscious of these hidden drivers, because until we address and heal the underlying cultural and personal trauma, our collective approach to sex will always be driven by fear and control, rather than genuine connection.
And as the conversation in the book shifts toward this concept of healing, it introduces a concept that I found highly suspenseful, almost awe-inspiring.
Expansion part.
Yes, expanding the erotic. Because if our narrow, medicalized, goal-oriented view of sex has traumatized us, what happens if we blow the definition wide open? What if intimacy isn't just about romantic or familial love?
This is where the psychology in the book beautifully merges with philosophy and ecology. Dr. Barker asks us to look at perspectives that fundamentally expand our capacity for connection.
It's a huge shift in thinking.
For instance, the book explores the experiences of asexuality and aromanticism. These are incredibly powerful reframings for society.
How so?
They demonstrate that a person can have a rich, profoundly intimate, deeply connected, and fulfilling life that does not center on romantic or sexual partnership. They help decouple the concept of intimacy from the physical sex act.
And Dr. Barker brings in these incredible perspectives from Black feminists like the legendary Audre Lorde.
Her work is so essential here.
Lorde wrote so powerfully about the erotic, not as a bedroom activity, but as a deep well of life force, of creative energy and joy.
Yes, a life force.
The book also weaves in indigenous writers and queer ecologists who emphasize our fundamental interconnectedness with the world around us. There's this concept introduced called ecosexuality.
Right, ecosexuality.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on this because I know what the listener is thinking. Ecosexuality, finding erotic and sensual engagement with nature, with the wild, with the elements.
It sounds a bit out there at first.
Are we talking about hugging a tree and calling it erotic? Come on. Aren't we just diluting the word erotic until it means absolutely nothing? How is a forest erotic?
It's a completely understandable skepticism. Our culture has trained us to associate the word erotic exclusively with pornography, capitalism, and the extraction of pleasure from another human body.
We think of it as a transaction.
But Dr. Barker, drawing on these ecological and feminist perspectives, asks us to define the erotic differently. Think about a moment when you felt profoundly, overwhelmingly alive.
Okay, like a specific memory.
Maybe you were swimming in the ocean, feeling the raw power of the waves and the salt on your skin, completely present in your physical body, feeling a deep sense of belonging to the earth.
Yeah, that rush of feeling connected to something bigger.
That profound aliveness,
Yeah.
that sensual connection to the world outside your own ego, that is what is meant by expanding the erotic.
So what does this all mean? It's about decentering the capitalism model of the self. The model where we are isolated individuals constantly competing, trying to extract a resource called pleasure from isolated transactional encounters.
That's a great way to summarize it.
This perspective sees us as totally physically entangled with the living world. Intimacy isn't just something you do in the dark behind a locked door. Intimacy becomes a baseline way of being alive to the universe.
Exactly. It's a radical expansion. It suggests that if we heal our trauma and dismantle the rigid hierarchies, we open ourselves up to a universe of sensual, joyful connection that isn't restricted to a four-step mechanical cycle.
So, as we look at the totality of Dr. Barker's work, it means the ultimate goal of psychology and the goal of our own personal development shouldn't be to categorize our dysfunctions.
We shouldn't be striving to be perfect machines.
It shouldn't be to put us in demographic boxes or to measure how efficiently we perform a mechanical sequence of acts to achieve a specific physical output.
The goal should be to heal our cultural and personal trauma.
To remove the heavy cloak of shame that keeps us disconnected, and to allow us to literally fall in love with the world, regarding all beings as our beloveds.
It is a beautiful, cohesive synthesis of the book's message. As we wrap up this exploration on the Plain Books podcast, the practical lessons we can draw from this work are profound and immediately applicable.
Give us the big takeaways.
Dr. Barker gives us a mandate. We must actively question the assumptions we hold about our own desires. Ask yourself, where did this script come from? And who actually benefits from me following it?
We have to interrogate our own minds.
We need to communicate openly and honestly about our unique, shifting biopsychosocial configurations without shame. And perhaps most importantly, we must treat our own bodies and the bodies of our partners with immense grace.
Grace is the perfect word for it.
We must honor their complex wisdom and natural rhythms rather than holding them to impossible, inherited mechanical standards.
I want to challenge you, the listener. Take these ideas from this book and let them actively enhance your life. Stop holding yourself to an invisible inherited hierarchy that was designed by men with clipboards a century ago.
You don't have to follow their rules anymore.
Give yourself permission to explore your own benign variations, whatever they may be, as long as they are rooted in joy and consent. And to help you do that, to truly understand the depth of what we've discussed today, I highly, highly recommend you go out and purchase a copy of this book, The Psychology of Sex, The Psychology of Everything by Meg-John Barker.
It is a phenomenal
It
resource.
is a necessary, life-altering addition to your library.
I completely agree. It is essential reading. And while you are reflecting on these concepts, I strongly encourage you to seek out Dr. Meg-John Barker on social media.
Yes, go find them online.
Engage with their ongoing work. They are constantly sharing brilliant, accessible insights on trauma, the nature of true consent, and how we go about the hard work of rewriting the rules of our lives.
Before we go, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to take with you into your week.
Something to keep the gears turning.
If the current definition of sex was invented by a handful of 19th century scientists and 20th century therapists, if it's all just a funhouse mirror that we built ourselves, what will the definition of sex look like 100 years from now?
A completely different world.
And more importantly, what power do you have to write that definition for yourself tonight?
A vital question to consider.
Thank you so much for being here and participating in this incredible episode. We invite you to follow, subscribe, and share the Playing Books podcast with anyone who needs to hear this message. Take care of yourselves.